Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our September 19th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope your harvest gets off to a safe and productive start. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and in today's episode, we'll bring you two guests. First, we'll have Iowa Farm Bureau President Brent Johnson join us to discuss the outcomes from Iowa Farm Bureau's annual policy conference, which happened earlier this month in West Des Moines. Then, we'll bring on state climatologist Dr. Glisan to give us his forecast for harvest and beyond. First up is President Brent Johnson, who sat down with spokesman editor Tom Block on the heels of Iowa Farm Bureau's annual policy conference. Those of you who are familiar with Farm Bureau policy know that this conference is really the culmination of a year-long process that includes input from all 99 counties, which makes for a great discussion and some really thoughtfully crafted policy positions. For more on that, here's Tom with President Brent Johnson.
We're talking with Brent Johnson, president of the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation, to recap the recent summer policy conference. Brent, before we dive into the issues that were discussed, what were your overall impressions of the policy discussions that took place and how they will guide the organization's effort for the upcoming year?
I was very, very happy with the level of conversations and debate that happened. Clearly, this is a year where there's a lot on our members' minds, and they wanted to talk about those issues, and it was very informative to sit and watch, listen to what they had to say, and it really speaks volumes just to our policy process. We've spent most of this year gathering these issues that we talked about just the other day, and to bring county members forward to work with all those issues surfaced and bring forward suggested opinions for themselves to deliberate and to watch them work through the rhetoric, make sure that they had their language correct and they were happy with their vision forward, really speaks volumes to the process that this organization put in place generations ago. It still works. It's still the most effective one in the country, to be quite honest. And, I'm really excited to take some of these actions forward and speak out for our members.
Pipeline projects have been garnering a lot of attention across Iowa this year with the proposals for various carbon pipelines, and the delegates had a lot of discussion about enhancing protections for landowners who might be affected by a pipeline or other energy infrastructure. What was the policy direction that came out of those discussions?
Our voting delegates really spoke to this issue on a few different levels. First of all, they wanted to make sure that as these infrastructure projects possibly get implemented across the state, if they are going to happen, are there crop losses being considered completely? To make sure that they had enough time in numbers of years to be properly compensated for the disturbance of the soil and the consequent loss in yield was something that they discussed, and that's important to them. And to find those points where, if there is issues and what is the restitution process. Currently in Iowa, farmers can talk to their county supervisors, and there are some members who wanted to have a more direct approach to that. So they have adopted policy that they would like another avenue added to that restitution process and being able to talk to the utilities board directly. And ultimately, the bigger conversation really revolved around eminent domain and property rights. And, that's something that always has been and will continue to be at the top of Farm Bureau's policy is private property owners' rights. And this is important to understand that our members, as they navigate this new project, the one that's being talked about is a carbon pipeline. This is a new product, a new space for our farmers, and they really spent a lot of time, and they were very diligent in exploring that. How does that play into renewable fuels and market access and all the things that are wrapped up around this new system. And ultimately, where our delegates came to the point was we're not opposing carbon pipelines, but we are adding some additional support in the terms of property rights for our members. We have talked with those carbon pipeline companies, and they've said that they want to use as little eminent domain as possible. And we certainly agree with that completely. And what our members ended up doing was they took our existing policy and just put some clarity around it. So what they wanted was to amend our policy to define that eminent domain threshold be more clearly defined at a minimum of 90% voluntary easements. And, so I think there's a lot of room in there that we can continue to work with some of these projects and still protect and enhance our members' private property rights.
One of the other issues at the state level that came up was a shortage of veterinarians. What solutions did the delegates offer to help address that issue?
When it comes to veterinarians, Iowa agriculture's really revolves a lot around animal agriculture, and animal care is at the top of the list for those producers involved in those systems. And as in any sector, labor is a shortage nearly everywhere right now. And so to properly be able to take care of our animals with the staff that's employed out in the country, our members were speaking to this issue and the point that they wanted those veterinarian technicians who are trained in certain procedures to have the authority to work on those animals under the supervision of the veterinarian that employs them.
On the national level, one of the topics of conversation was the Farm Bill. What are some of the key priorities Iowa farmers would like to see in the 2023 Farm Bill as those talks begin?
That's something that we did spend a lot of time on as well. This is going to be a large farm bill when we get down to it, and there's a lot of our House members on the U.S. House that have never spoken to the appropriations process of a farm bill. So we talked a lot about the education aspect, but ultimately when it comes down to what's going to be in the farm bill, subsidized crop insurance and risk management assurance are the top priorities for this upcoming farm bill as far as our members are concerned. Priorities also include trade and market development, ag research, and conservation. There seems to always be a bubbling up of climate-smart ag practices. Those issues were touched on as well, and they want to make sure that as we explore those opportunities that they remain voluntary and in the private sector.
Brent, input costs, particularly for fertilizer, have been one of the issues that you've spent a lot of time on this year. What are some of the solutions that delegates discussed regarding inputs?
Input costs have been something that's really been a hot topic for the last year and a half to 2 years. And as we look forward to the production cycles in 2023, it continues. And a lot of the issues at hand do revolve around the fertilizer conversations and how are those global conversations happening. And so they really spent some time. They came up with a policy talking about increasing our domestic input production, and in the same vein, streamlining the regulatory approval process. So, what can we do to produce those fertilizers and chemicals domestically? And those plants that are currently in the build phase, how can we help them streamline their regulatory approvals so that we can get those plants online and continue to develop our domestic production to take care of ourselves into the future?
Now, our work isn't yet done on those national issues. What's the next step for the policy recommendations that were made regarding national issues?
As far as the national issues goes, what we're going to do, myself and our national policy advisor, Daniel, we're going to be working over the next couple months, working with other states' presidents and policy development people, bringing forward the national issues that Iowa felt were important and trying to find those coalitions and build bridges and get these issues brought forward into the AFBF policy book. And so we're going to be continuing to work on that process. And then when we have our annual meeting in December for Iowa, our voting delegates will then elect their American Farm Bureau delegates. We'll make the final push then in January as we all go to the AFBF annual meeting and meet on the voting delegate body floor and finalize this year's run for our national policies.
Yeah, so it truly is. It's a year-round process. There's no beginning and no end. It just continues to go on.
Yeah, we constantly have a website that's logging new ideas. So if you're a member, go to iowafarmbureau.com and type in your issue, and it really, the issues start there. So every year we get hundreds of potential policies, and we work through that process, and that exploratory process of developing those potential policies, it is continuous. And then once we actually get to that final stage point, we take those policies and go into the implementation stage, and the development process starts over again. So we're always in some cycle of policy exploration.
But I know I've talked to members who have seen their policies that they've surfaced at the county level become state law or go to the national level.
That's one of the things that, as we talk to members across the state, occasionally you'll find somebody like that, and it's really fun to engage and understand that if you've got an idea at your kitchen table and you're a member of this organization, this is an opportunity that you can implement that idea and see that process and get involved and push it forward. And, maybe someday that does end up on the governor's desk or the president's desk and does become law at some point in time. It's happened before. It will happen again.
You won't find a more thorough grassroots policy development process than the one we have here at Farm Bureau. We appreciate President Johnson coming on to give us the latest, and as you heard in that discussion, it's truly a year-round process. So, if you're a Farm Bureau member with input on policy positions that can strengthen Iowa and agriculture, we'd love to hear from you at iowafarmbureau.com. Next, we have Dr. Justin Glisan, who serves as Iowa's state climatologist. No one appreciates a good weather forecast more than farmers, and that's especially true this time of year. Spokesman reporter Bob Beyond caught up with Dr. Glisan last week to discuss his outlook for harvest and beyond.
Justin, welcome. Thanks for being with us today. Let's start with recapping the summer weather. How best can we describe June to August weather in Iowa?
So generally warm and dry across the state. If we look at the statewide temperature, we were about 1.2 degrees above average. So not extremely warm, but definitely warmer than what we would expect climatologically. And as a reminder to your listeners, climatology is the last full 3 decades, and that's the averaging period that we use. So 1991 to 2020. So if we use that as a ranking back 150 years, it was the 58th warmest out of 150 years. Precipitation-wise, dry, with that dry behavior that we've seen, drought expansion across southern Iowa, but also degradation in northwestern Iowa. So if we look at precipitation, we were about 3.3 inches below average, and that ranks as the 29th driest. So if we consider the last few years, 2020 was a drier summer, but definitely with these drier conditions, we do see more pervasive drought. Also, with a drier summertime, less severe weather. So we didn't have a lot of severe weather events across the state.
It seems like some spotty areas received heavy downpours while others received nothing. In my area of West Des Moines, as example, we received no moisture from July through early August. Could you address these situations Iowa experienced this past summer?
Yep. Unfortunately, this is a trend that we've been seeing over the last several decades, especially in the warm season where precipitation is thunderstorm driven. As we know, thunderstorms are very small spatially on a spatial scale, so you'll have rain gauges that get an inch or two over 24 hours or even over a few hours, and then 5 miles in either direction, north or south, east or west, you get nothing. So higher spatial variability when we come to thunderstorms. What we've seen trend-wise, we're getting wetter across the state, about 0.4 of an inch per decade since 1895, so wetter as a state, but we're seeing higher intensity rainfall events more often. So you're getting spots, basically northeastern Iowa, that's near normal in terms of precipitation over summertime. Then you look at northwestern Iowa with D3 drought. It balances out, but you have sources and sinks of precipitation. So it's basically the haves and the have-nots, and that's what we've seen built into the trends.
Much of Iowa and the Midwest have experienced drought conditions. What has been the cause of drought, and will there be any relief in sight?
We've seen relief recently due to some more widespread rainfall events, but we can track this drought back to 2020. So when you have a multi-year drought, that's where you start to see precipitation deficits stacking up, especially northwestern Iowa, where we see D3 on a scale of D0 to D4. So we wouldn't expect D3 drought in a location once but every 30 to 40 years. So it's a very pervasive drought we see up there. Going back 2.5 years, precipitation deficits on the order of 15 to 25 inches below average. Now you look at southern Iowa, where we've seen recently an expansion of D1 and D2 drought, that moderate to extreme category. That's more of a reflection of what we call flash drought or shorter term drought, where we have precipitation deficits on the order of 8 to 12 inches going out, let's say 60, 90, 6 months. So shorter term drought conditions versus those longer term precipitation deficits across northwestern Iowa. So where we see the drought improvement last year, October was the 8th wettest October on record, again, going back 149 years at that time. So it really staved off an expansion of drought conditions into winter and spring. Now, your listeners might ask, well, drought in winter, that doesn't make a lot of sense. The soil's frozen. We don't get a lot of water content from snowpack. But you can definitely have drought expanding if you don't experience precipitation, snowfall that you would expect January and February and even into March. So overall, we've seen some improvement on the short term given a more active storm track over the last several weeks. But to get out of this drought or to start to put a chip in those precipitation deficits, we would need months and months, if not more than a year, of climatologically expected or above average precipitation to really start removing those categories, D3 category that we see in northwestern Iowa.
Could you explain La Nina, how it works, and its effects for the Midwest and Iowa?
Yes. So La Nina is the cold phase of what everybody probably knows as El Nino, which is the warm phase. And when I say cold phase and warm phase, this is a sea surface temperature anomaly in the tropical Pacific. So colder than average temperatures in the sea surface, warmer than average on the El Nino side. So La Nina, as I mentioned, the cold phase, that pushes thunderstorm activity further west in the Pacific Basin, and then you get a high pressure system that sets up over that colder water. We think of high pressure as happy weather, stable weather. Well, when you have stable weather, basically over the Gulf of Alaska, it impacts where the jet stream sets up over the United States, and hence where the storm track sets up. So if we look at analog years in which we've seen La Nina going from fall into winter, as we're currently looking at in the forecast and climatological models, we experience wetter conditions in the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes, the Pacific Northwest, colder temperatures across the upper Midwest, and then warm, drier conditions across the southern states. Iowa just happens to be in the middle of that interface. So any oscillation in that jet stream behavior can give us changes in the weather pattern. So cold air outbreaks, higher snowfall events, and interestingly enough, if you look at the strength of La Nina from a weak phase to a strong phase, in a weak phase we expect more snowpack. In a strong phase we expect less snowpack than normal. But overall, if we look at La Nina years for fall into winter, La Nina typically gives us slightly colder temperatures and then near normal snowpack, so near normal conditions. Now, why this is an interesting experience we've been going through, this is the third year of La Nina. Going back to 1950, we only have 2 events on record where we've had La Nina for 3 years. So we talk about crystal balls a lot, looking into the crystal ball, what do we expect? Well, given the anomalous nature of this third year of La Nina, we kind of don't know what to expect. But if we look at our seasonal outlooks that get us September, October, and November, and then the winter iteration, now again, we're still a season out, we do experience in fall, and the outlooks are showing us warmer temperatures and drier conditions, so warmer and dry. Now that's good for dry down in the field, that's good for harvest. We don't get into wet conditions as we did in 2018 and 2019 when we were in the ENSO neutral phase. But definitely a very interesting set of 3 years. It's been a long time since we've had La Nina hang around from winter into spring, through summer, and then into fall, and then the projection into winter. So again, very anomalous, and we'll be studying this event for years.
Do you expect La Nina to linger another year or longer? We're hearing it's already been 3 years, which is unusual.
We don't have an expectation moving a year out. Now, if we go month to month into winter, we do have a better chance than not of La Nina hanging around. Now, I mentioned that La Nina is a sea surface temperature anomaly. Well, for La Nina to stick around, and El Nino on the flip side of that, the ocean has to couple with the atmosphere for that behavior to affect the jet stream over the United States. We're still seeing that coupling together, but as the probabilities of La Nina start to diminish as we get into wintertime, you could see a decoupling of the sea surface behavior with the atmosphere, and that could quash La Nina or change the behavior that we expect. But as we mentioned in our previous question, in La Nina winters, and what we're seeing in the outlooks for fall, warm and dry in fall, and then near normal snowpack, and then maybe slightly cooler temperatures in wintertime.
As we head into harvest time in Iowa, what should farmers expect as far as Iowa weather patterns? What should they plan for?
Yes. So Iowa weather is variable. That's why my job is so interesting. Everybody loves to talk about weather. But if we do look at those short-term outlooks again, we are seeing through the middle of September into the end of the month, elevated signals for warmer temperatures. But we're also seeing a wetter signal, at least in the middle of September. Now, as I mentioned, the seasonal outlooks and the initial outlooks for October suggest, again, that warmer and drier signal holding on through fall. So what this portends for harvest is good conditions. Those are helpful conditions in terms of dry down in the field as opposed to using propane to dry the grain that the combines pick out of the field. I mentioned 2018, 2019, very wet falls, some of the wettest falls that we've seen on record. We had delayed harvest. We were harvesting grain the next season that was still in the field. We're not seeing that in the outlooks. We're seeing very, I would say, beneficial outlooks in terms of harvest. Not so much on the drought side, but we can address that after we get harvested.
What are the chances for an early frost? And what effect that would have on harvest planning?
Yes. There are multiple stressors when it comes to our farmers out in the fields. Right now, middle of September, getting into the middle of September, there is no scientific forecastability of an early frost or freeze at this point. Now, we get towards the end of September, that's where we start to look at our short-term outlooks, 6 to 10, 8 to 14-day outlooks. If we start to see a higher probability of colder temperatures develop, they won't tell us how much below average will be, but they'll suggest to us that we're going to get into a cold weather configuration in the atmosphere. Then we can start to look at those 7 to 10-day forecasts, the actual forecasts that tell us we can expect overnight lows in the 30s, daytime highs in the 60s or 70s. We can couple those together, and that gives us a better behavior. Climatologically, if we look at the last 30 years of frost and freeze events, so the frost events, the 28-degree killing frost, I should say, those are projected basically climatologically first to second week of October. So we were delayed planting in April, but we did catch up with those warm stretches in May, June, and July. So if we look at those growing degree day units and even discussions with field agronomists this morning, we have black layering in corn right now. So once you get past that maturity, early frost or freeze won't impact those crops. Now, if you have flowers planted, of course, you can have those killed. But overall, as we stand right now, we don't have a forecastability for those early frost and freeze. We just fall back on the climatological behavior. As I mentioned, with the seasonal outlooks and the outlooks for September, those are trending warm. So that does tell us that we're not going to get into a cold configuration.
And finally, we're hearing different predictions about winter. Some are saying cold and snowy for Iowa. What are your models showing?
We talk about the Farmer's Almanac. We talk about the Climate Prediction Center. We talk about the atmospheric behavior that we're seeing, La Nina. If we look at the analog years in which La Nina has hung around, 2020, 2021, and now it looks like projected into 2022. 2020, we had above average snowpack. 2021, we were near average. And again, this depends on where you are across the state. We, of course, had cold weather outbreaks, but we were near seasonal when it came to temperature for December, January, February. So the expectation, if we look at analog years of La Nina going into winter, along with our current outlooks, they are trending as we move through fall into winter, warmer and slightly drier. But then we fall back on the classic La Nina signature that we see in the Midwest. Wetter than average conditions, meaning snowier than average conditions in the Ohio Valley, Pacific Northwest, and the Great Lakes. dry conditions across the southern state. Again, we're in the middle of that interface, which gives me heartburn because it's hard to get a good, robust forecast for winter. But overall, as I mentioned, La Ninas we typically see near normal snowpack across the state. So again, this goes into the question, what is your definition of cold and snowy? It depends on where you're from, right?
Well, let's hope for those favorable harvest conditions that Dr. Glisan was referencing. With all of the volatility farmers are facing these days, we'd all welcome some weather that's ideal for bringing in the harvest. Okay, one more thing before we wrap up this episode. Saturday, October 1st is the annual America Needs Farmers Game Day at Kinnick Stadium. Whether you're able to join us in person or tune in on the radio, we want to let you know that we've got a lot planned for the day. That includes our pregame tailgate tent, located just south of Kinnick, which is a chance for fans to stop by and play games, win prizes, and learn about the many reasons that America needs farmers. You can also come grab an autograph from former Hawkeye great Tony Moiaki, who will become the 10th former Hawkeye added to the America Needs Farmers Wall of Honor at Kinnick Stadium. And that's just for starters, with more A&F and farmer recognition planned throughout the game. It really is a day-long celebration of our farm families, and it comes during a time when fans can clearly see, out there in the fields, just how much farmers' work means to them. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for our next one on October 3rd. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.